The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. This classic of American literature is reimagined as if it had been written by Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut was an American writer known for his satirical and darkly humorous novels that often blend science fiction with social commentary. His unique voice and distinctive style have made him a beloved and influential figure in American literature. Vonnegut's writing style often features short, simple sentences, repetitive phrases, and a conversational tone, which makes his work accessible and engaging. He frequently uses recurring motifs and characters across his novels, creating a cohesive body of work that reflects his distinctive worldview. Please like and subscribe to get more of this great content of classic books reimagined.
Introduction: The Great American Dialect Cook-Off. So here's the deal. This book is a veritable Babel of tongues, a linguistic jamboree featuring the Missouri Negro dialect, a backwoods southwestern twang so thick you could stir it with a stick, the no-nonsense Pike County talk, and 4 specially tailored offshoots of that dialect, each more peculiar than the last. Why all this fuss over dialects, you ask? It wasn't just for kicks, nor was it the product of throwing darts at a dictionary. No, this medley was concocted painstakingly, with the kind of meticulous care that only someone who's waded through these dialects, lived and breathed them, could muster. And why am I telling you this? Because, my dear reader, without this little disclaimer, you might think all these characters were supposed to sound the same. Spoiler alert, they don't. They can't even if they tried. Imagine them in a grand, chaotic choir, each singing a different tune, none harmonizing, but all earnestly belting their hearts out. So, buckle up. If you're looking to pin down a motive in this narrative, I might have to call the authorities. Looking for a moral? You'll be kindly shown the door. And as for finding a plot, well, best not to get any ideas. We wouldn't want any literary casualties, now would we? Chapter 1. The Truth, the Whole Truth, and Other Hazardous Materials.
You probably haven't the faintest who I am unless you've trudged through The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. No loss there. That tale was spun by Mr. Mark Twain, who stuck to the truth as often as a politician in election season. Sure, he embroidered here and there, but who doesn't? I've yet to meet a soul who hasn't cooked up a fib or two, except maybe Aunt Polly or the widow or possibly Mary. Those ladies are from the same book, by the way, mostly a catalog of truths with a few stretchers, as Twain himself might admit. Now let me tell you how that yarn ends. Tom and I stumble upon some cash the robbers stashed in a cave, and just like that, we're rolling in dough. $6,000 each, all in glittering gold. It was a sight, enough to make your eyes pop. Judge Thatcher, bless his soul, invested it for us, turning it into a neat $1 a day. Who knew money could breed money? The widow Douglas, in her infinite kindness, adopted me, vowing to scrub the wild right out of me. It was a noble effort, marred only by its utter predictability and how it made my life a living schedule. So, when the walls started closing in, I bolted. I went back to my roots, rags and a sugar hogshead, and it felt glorious. Until Tom, that eternal schemer, roped me back with tales of starting a band of robbers. The catch? I had to return to the widow and play the part of a civilized young gentleman. So, back I went. The widow wept over my return, labeling me a poor lost lamb, among other things, though she meant no harm. She stuffed me back into those starchy new clothes. I was sweating like a pig at a barbecue, feeling all kinds of confined. Then the old routine kicked back in. The widow had this ritual of mumbling over her food like it had personally offended her, even though there was nothing wrong with it, aside from being bland beyond belief. Post-supper, she'd haul out her book and preach about Moses and the bulrushers. I was all ears until she casually mentioned Moses had kicked the bucket ages ago. Well, that killed my interest. Dead folks are just that, dead. I tried asking to smoke, but no dice. The widow lectured me on the evils of tobacco, while she herself took snuff like it was divine. Hypocrisy at its finest, I'd say. Here she was, fussing over a long-gone Moses and turning her nose up at my smoking, which at least had some earthly benefits. Then there was Miss Watson, a rail-thin spinster with goggles thick as soda bottle glasses, who decided I needed education. She drilled me with a spelling book until I thought I'd turn into alphabet soup. It was as dull as watching paint dry, and I got antsier by the minute. Miss Watson was big on manners, constantly nagging me to sit up straight, not to yawn or stretch, made me wish for any sort of escape. Even the bad place she threatened would be my next stop unless I shaped up. She tried selling me on heaven, which, according to her, was an eternal choir practice. Not my cup of tea. I much preferred to aim for somewhere less sing-songy. Tom Sawyer, my partner in crime, wasn't likely to make the choir either, and that suited me just fine. So, as the nights drew on, I lay there listening to the mournful symphony of the woods, feeling lonelier than a mayfly in December. The wind whispered secrets I couldn't catch, an owl mourned in the distance, and a ghost seemed to be trying to get a word in edgewise, probably about the dire state of afterlife communications. Then, the house went dead quiet, save for the tick-tock of a distant clock and my own thudding heart. I heard a twig snap, a cat's meow, and I knew it was time to make my exit. I snuffed out the light, shimmied out the window, and there in the dark, like a promise of more adventures, was Tom.
Chapter 2: Midnight Misadventures and the Birth of Tom Sawyer's Gang of Prepubescent Bandits.
There we were, skulking through the night like a pair of ninjas, if ninjas clumsily navigated suburban backyards instead of sleek Tokyo rooftops. The path behind Widow Douglas's garden was our chosen route, a trail littered with enough roots and branches to sabotage any stealthy intentions. Sure enough, as we crept past the kitchen, I tripped over a root, the universe's way of reminding me of my inherent clumsiness. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the still night, prompting us to collapse to the ground in a panic. From the shadows of the kitchen doorway, Jim, Miss Watson's big man, appeared silhouetted against the flickering light. He stood like a sentinel, his presence alone enough to make us hold our breath. He craned his neck, scanning the darkness as he asked the night air, "Who-da?" We lay there, frozen, while Jim's ears worked overtime, picking up nothing but the deceitful silence. Finally, he tiptoed toward our hiding spot, close enough to touch. A tense few minutes passed. It's funny how time stretches out like taffy when you're trying not to make a sound. During this eternity of waiting, every part of my body decided to itch. First my ankle, then my ear, and soon my back. It was as though a colony of ants had declared war on me. I remembered my mom's words about how itches always strike at the worst times, like at funerals or when you're trying to sleep. True enough, here I was, a testament to that bizarre phenomenon. Finally, Jim settled down right between me and Tom, leaning against a tree with a heavy sigh, his legs stretched out, brushing mine, as his snores eventually filled the air, offering a strange comfort. Tom signaled with a quiet mouth click, a secret code of our own making, and we resumed our escape on hands and knees. Once we gained some distance, Tom's mischievous spirit surfaced. He proposed tying Jim to the tree for a bit of sport. I quickly shut that down. Too risky. Too noisy. Undeterred, Tom remembered the dwindling candle supply and decided to risk a trip back to the kitchen. Despite my protests, he slid back and returned triumphant with 3 stolen candles, leaving behind a nickel as a pirate's honor. We made our getaway just in time, Tom pausing only to play one last prank, placing Jim's hat on a limb directly above him. Jim, half stirring in his sleep, was none the wiser. Later, Jim would concoct a wild story about witches and enchantments that supposedly spirited him across the state and back. Each time he retold his tale, the journey grew more elaborate, until he claimed witches had carried him around the world. His newfound fame made him a local celebrity among the other workers, all eager to hear about his mystical travels. Back with the gang, hidden in the old tan yard, Tom laid down the law. Now, we'll start this band of robbers and call it Tom Sawyer's Gang. Everybody that wants to join has got to take an oath and write his name in blood. The boys, wide-eyed and eager, agreed without hesitation. Tom read aloud the oath he'd composed, a dramatic pledge involving secrecy, loyalty, and some alarmingly detailed penalties for betrayal. It sounded like something straight out of a dime novel, with every boy vowing to defend the gang at all costs. Discussion soon turned to practical matters, such as the implications of our oath for those without immediate family. "What about Huck?" one boy asked, noting my lack of relatives. "Well, hasn't he got a father?" Tom replied, though everyone knew my PA was as reliable as a paper anchor. In a twisted moment of inspiration, I suggested Miss Watson could be my family target. The group quickly accepted, sealing my membership. We each pricked our fingers, and I pressed mine against the paper, signing away my better judgment. "Now," Ben Rogers asked, "what's the line of business of this gang?" "Nothing but robbery and murder," Tom declared boldly, as though he were an expert on criminal enterprises. "Must we always kill the people?" Another boy chimed in, his voice shaky. "Certainly," Tom insisted with mock gravity. "It's best, Some authorities think differently, but mostly it's considered best to kill them, except some that you bring to the cave here and keep them till they're ransomed. Ransomed? What's that? Came the confused query. I don't know, but that's what they do in the books, so it's what we've got to do, Tom concluded, as if that settled everything. By the end of the night, promises of future mischief and mayhem hung thick in the air as we each snuck back home. The weight of our new outlaw status is heavy on our shoulders. I climbed through my window just as dawn was breaking, my clothes ruined, my body exhausted, but my young heart thrilling at the thought of tomorrow's adventures.
Chapter 3. The Cosmic Joke and the Snipe Hunt.
Well, it was a fine morning when Miss Watson decided it was time for my soul to get another good scrubbing. She dragged me out of bed, my clothes still reeking of yesterday's adventures, and set to scrubbing me like I was the floor of a butcher shop. But the widow, bless her decrepit heart, she just looked at me with those pitying eyes of hers, cleaned off the muck, and sighed in that way that made you think maybe you ought to shape up for a day or two. Miss Watson, with all the zeal of a traveling preacher, hauled me into the closet and commenced to praying so hard I thought the roof would cave in. She told me to pray every day, and whatever I asked for would be mine. Sure, why not? This sounded like a sweet deal. I tried it. Once, I got a fish line. No hooks, though. Guess the Almighty had a sense of humor. I prayed for hooks, and after a few rounds of divine silence, I asked Miss Watson for a hand. She called me a fool, which didn't quite match the saintly image she was going for. So there I was, sitting in the woods, pondering the cosmic injustices. If prayer worked, why was Deacon Wynn still whining about his lost pork money? Why wasn't the widow's silver snuff box back where it belonged? And why on God's green earth didn't Miss Watson fatten up like a Christmas goose? Clearly, divine vending machines were a bust. The widow told me about spiritual gifts, basically doing good deeds and never thinking about myself. Yeah, right. I mulled it over for a long spell in the woods, but couldn't see the point. Other people might benefit, sure, but what about me? So I decided to let it go. The widow's talk of Providence was sweet like molasses, but Miss Watson would smack it down like a cheap carnival whack-a-mole. There had to be two Providences, the widow's and Miss Watson's. And if a poor soul fell under Miss Watson's providence, he might as well kiss his sorry existence goodbye. I figured I'd take my chances with the widow's, even though I couldn't see how it'd be any better. Pap, my dear old dad, hadn't been seen for over a year, which suited me just fine. The old man had a talent for turning sober beatings into an art form. Folks said he'd drowned in the river, but I knew better. A drowned man floats on his face, not his back. So the dead man they found must have been some poor lady dressed in man's rags. Comforting thought, really. We dabbled in robbery for a month, pretending to be grand thieves under Tom Sawyer's delusions. Hog drivers and women in carts were our targets, but we never took a thing. Tom called the hogs ingots and the turnips jewelry. We'd sit in the cave recounting our imaginary exploits. Tom, ever the grand storyteller, once declared we'd ambush a caravan of Spanish merchants and rich Arabs with a bazillion elephants and camels. Of course, it turned out to be a Sunday school picnic. We scattered the kids, grabbed some donuts, and ran when the teacher came charging in. No diamonds, no treasure, just jam and a rag doll. I told Tom it was all nonsense, but he swore by his enchanted book, Don Quixote. It was the magicians, he said. They turned the whole thing into a Sunday school just to spite us. I suggested going after the magicians, but Tom called me a numbskull. Why, Huck, a magician could call up genies that'd tear you to bits before you could blink. They're as tall as trees and wide as churches. Well, why don't we get some genies to help us? How you gonna get them, huh? I don't know. How do they get them? They rub an old lamp or ring and poof! Genies come roaring in with thunder and lightning, ready to obey. Well, I'd make that genie climb the highest tree in the country if it was me. Shucks, Huck, you don't know nothing. I thought it over, grabbed an old tin lamp and ring, and rubbed till I was soaked in sweat. No genies. Just another one of Tom Sawyer's grand lies. I reckoned he believed in his enchanted Arabs and elephants, but as for me, it had all the makings of a Sunday school.
Chapter 4. Superstitions and Securities, or Huck's Financial and Mystical Misadventures.
3 or 4 months whizzed by, the cold breath of winter puffing down our necks. By now, I was practically a scholar, or as close as one gets when you can barely wrestle the multiplication table to 6 times 7 equals 35. Beyond that, mathematics was as foreign to me as Martian poetry. Initially, school was about as enjoyable as a tooth extraction, but it grew on me. Whenever the academic rigor mortis set in, I'd play hooky. The subsequent thrashing I'd receive seemed a fair trade for a day of freedom. The more I endured school, the less it bothered me. I was adapting, evolving into a civilized creature, much to everyone's surprise, especially the widow's. She claimed I was progressing slow but sure, and for once wasn't embarrassed to parade me in public. One fateful morning, I accidentally knocked over the salt cellar at breakfast. Old superstitions die hard. I lunged for a pinch to toss over my left shoulder, a feeble defense against impending doom. But Miss Watson, ever the buzzkill, thwarted my attempt. "Take your hands away, Huckleberry! What a mess you are always making," she scolded. The widow tried to defend me, but we all knew that spilled salt was a herald of bad luck. I left the house feeling like a storm cloud was about to burst over my head. I wandered out to the garden, climbed over the stile, and noticed fresh tracks in the new snow. They meandered from the quarry, loitered around the stile suspiciously, and then trailed off around the fence. Curiosity nibbled at me. I bent down to examine the footprints, and lo and behold, a cross made with big nails was hammered into the left boot heel, a talisman to keep the devil at bay. Whatever poor soul made these tracks was taking no chances. With the urgency of a cat on a hot tin roof, I skedaddled down to Judge Thatcher's place. Out of breath and anxious, I burst through his door. "My boy, you look like you've seen a ghost. Here for your interest money?" he asked. "No, sir," I puffed. "Is there some for me?" "Indeed, over $150 came in last night. A small fortune. You'd be wise to let me invest it with your other 6,000. If it burns a hole in your pocket, there's no telling what you'd squander it on." "No, sir," I insisted, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of wealth. "I don't want it. I want you to take it. All of it. The 6,000, too." The judge looked as if I'd sprouted another head. "Why, what can you mean, my boy?" "Just take it, please. No questions," I pleaded, fearing that any explanation might trap me in a web of lies. He pondered for a moment, then a light bulb flickered on behind his eyes. "Ah, you wish to sell your property to me. Not give it, that's the proper transaction." He scribbled on a piece of paper, pushed it towards me with $1, and instructed me to sign. So I did. Later, under the veil of night, I sought out Jim, Miss Watson's slave, who claimed his hairball, from the stomach of an ox, mind you, knew everything. Desperate for some insight into my pap's recent tracks in the snow, I told Jim my fears. Jim consulted the hairball with a seriousness reserved for divine oracles. He dropped it on the floor. It thudded ominously and barely rolled. After several attempts and no clear answers, Jim resorted to listening directly to the hairball, hoping for a whisper of fate. "It's shy tonight," he concluded. "Sometimes it demands payment to talk." I offered a slick counterfeit quarter, barely passing for currency. Jim, ever the resourceful magician, decided to encase it in a raw potato overnight, claiming it would fool anyone by morning, hairball included. The next day, Jim reassured me, the enchanted hairball was more cooperative. It spun a tale of my life, trouble and joy, sickness and health, 2 women circling my fate like moons, one light, one dark, one poor, one rich. And ominously, it advised me to steer clear of water and risky ventures, for a noose might be dangling at the end of my journey. That night, as I climbed to my room, the air thick with Jim's forebodings, I found Pap, as real and grim as the predictions I'd just heard, sitting on my bed. The night, it seemed, was far from over.
Chapter 5. The Prodigal's Return and the Farce of Reform.
I had just shut the door when I turned around, and there he was, the man who taught me to run faster than a rabbit and hit harder than a mule, dear old Pap. Once upon a time, his very presence could make my blood run cold. But now, I realized he was just a ghost of a nightmare. All bark and no bite. Pap looked every bit his near 50 years, each one etched into his greasy, tangled hair and rat's nest of a beard. His eyes glowed like a madman's through the grime. His skin was ghostly white, the kind of white that made you think of fish bellies or tree toads, not healthy men. His clothes were nothing but rags. His boots barely held together with 2 toes poking through like they were trying to escape. His hat was on the floor, a battered old slouch with the top caved in like someone had sat on it. He sat there, eyeing me, like a hawk with his chair tilted back. I put down the candle, noticing the window was open. He must have climbed in from the shed. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he finally spoke. "Well, look at you in your fancy, starchy clothes. You think you're some kind of big shot now, don't you? Maybe I am. Maybe I ain't, I said, feeling a spark of defiance. Don't you give me any of your lip, he snapped. You've put on a lot of airs since I've been gone. I'll knock you down a peg or two. You think you're better than your old man just because you can read and write now. I'll show you what's what. Who told you you could meddle with that highfalutin nonsense? The widow. She told me, I replied. The widow, eh? And who told her she could poke her nose into our business? No one. She just did. Well, I'll teach her to mind her own business. And you're done with school, you hear? I'll learn people to bring up a boy to put on airs over his own father. Your mother couldn't read or write, and neither could I. You ain't no better than the rest of us. Now read to me. I picked up a book and started reading about General Washington and his wars. Pap listened for a bit before smacking the book out of my hand. So, you can read, huh? Well, you cut that out, or I'll tan you good. Next thing, you'll be getting religion. I never saw such a son. He picked up a little picture of some cows and a boy, a prize I got for good lessons.
What's this? He sneered.
Something they gave me for learning my lessons, I said. He tore it up. I'll give you something better, a good cowhide. He sat there mumbling and grumbling, then started again. Ain't you a sweet-scented dandy? A bed, bedclothes, a looking-glass, and even a carpet on the floor. Meanwhile, your own father has to sleep with the hogs. I'll take some of these airs out of you yet. They say you're rich. How's that? They lie, I said. Watch your mouth. I've been in town 2 days and heard nothing but you being rich. That's why I'm here. Get me that money tomorrow. I want it. I ain't got no money, I told him. Liar. Judge Thatcher's got it. You get it. Ask Judge Thatcher yourself. He'll tell you the same. All right, I will. How much you got on you now? I got $1. I need it for... Don't matter what you need it for. Hand it over. Nick. He took the dollar, bit it to see if it was real, and then said he was going to town to get some whiskey. As he left, he poked his head back in and cursed me for putting on airs and trying to be better than him. He warned me about going to school again and stumbled off. The next day, drunk as a lord, Pap went to Judge Thatcher and tried to bully him into handing over the money. When that didn't work, he swore he'd get the law to do it. The judge and the widow tried to get the court to make one of them my guardian, but the new judge wouldn't interfere, saying it wasn't right to separate families. Pap was thrilled. He said he'd beat me black and blue if I didn't get him money. I borrowed $3 from Judge Thatcher, and Pap got drunk again, causing a ruckus till they jailed him. He was back before the court the next day, jailed again for a week. Pap was satisfied, claiming he was the boss of his son and would make my life miserable. When he got out, the new judge decided to reform him, took him to his house, cleaned him up, and fed him well. After supper, he lectured him about temperance until Pap cried and swore he'd turn over a new leaf. The judge and his wife hugged and cried with him, believing every word. Pap signed a pledge, and they put him to bed in a fine room. That night, Pap got thirsty, climbed out onto the porch roof, slid down a stanchion, traded his new coat for a jug of rotgut, and had himself a grand old time. By morning, he was drunk as a skunk, fell off the porch, broke his arm in 2 places, and was nearly frozen when they found him. The judge was disillusioned, reckoning that the only way to reform Pap was with a shotgun.
Chapter 6. The Misadventures of Huck and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day.
As the days turned colder and the nights longer, my old man, in a spectacular display of parental concern, made it his life's mission to reclaim what he considered rightfully his. The stash of money Judge Thatcher was safeguarding on my behalf. He wasn't content with just terrorizing the legal system. He also felt compelled to disrupt my educational pursuits with a few well-timed thrashings. Still, I persevered with school, partly out of spite, and partly because dodging Pap became easier than dodging homework. The lawsuit crept along at the pace of a snail mired in molasses. In the meantime, I found myself extorting small sums from the judge under the guise of keeping the peace at home. Really, it was to prevent my hide from being tanned too regularly. With each cash infusion, Pap transformed into the town terror, culminating in his regular incarceration. He was a man of simple pleasures, really. His obsession with meddling didn't stop at the courthouse. He loitered around the widow's place until she, fed up with his antics, threatened legal action. This threat bruised his ego, and he vowed to assert his dominance. True to form, he ambushed me one spring day, hauling me upriver to a secluded shack hidden so deep in the Illinois woods you'd swear it was a figment of your imagination. Our new home was as rustic as it gets, a cabin that time forgot, with Pap keeping the key under his pillow as if it guarded the crown jewels. Our days settled into a monotonous pattern. Fishing and hunting supplied our table, while Pap's trips to trade our spoils for whiskey supplied his thirst. Each return trip he'd celebrate by getting as drunk as a lord and dispensing his own brand of paternal discipline. Eventually, the widow pinpointed our rustic hideout and attempted a rescue operation. It failed spectacularly when Pap greeted her emissary with the business end of his stolen gun. Despite the circumstances, I found a certain peace in the wilderness, a stark contrast to the oppressive civility at the widow's. The freedom of no chores, no schedules, and no Miss Watson was marred only by the sting of the cowhide. Yet even the most idyllic exile has its limits. Pap's enthusiasm for the switch grew unbearable. After one particularly brutal session, coupled with his frequent absences, I plotted my escape. His 3-day disappearance, which left me locked alone in the cabin, was the final straw. I imagined him lying face down in some muddy riverbank, and I shivered at the thought of never escaping the cabin's confines. Desperate, I scoured our grim abode for anything that might aid in my escape. My persistence paid off when I discovered an old, rusty wood saw hidden beneath the roof's clapboards. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Behind the cover of an old horse blanket, I began the painstaking work of sawing through one of the cabin's thick logs, envisioning freedom with every stroke. I was close to breaking through when the distant sound of Pap's gun froze me in my tracks. Hastily, I concealed my escape attempt and prepared for his return. He stormed in, fouler than usual, spewing curses at every conceivable target: government, the widow, and the universe at large. He ranted about the ongoing legal battles, his surety of victory if only the trial would commence, and his suspicion of another custody challenge from the widow. This filled me with dread, not for fear of the widow, but for the cramped and civilized life she represented. As the evening wore on, Pap's tirades against the government and his lot in life grew more animated, particularly after he stumbled in from town, plastered in mud and madder than a hornet. His drunken diatribes were a sight to behold, a man unhinged, railing against everything from local governance to cosmic injustice. His paranoia peaked as he plotted to hide me even deeper in the wilderness, should the widow attempt to claim me. But I was resolved not to wait for his plan to unfold. That night, as he lay drunk and delirious, I readied myself. If he passed out sufficiently, I would make my escape. However, fate had other plans. Pap, in his stupor, began hallucinating, seeing snakes and devils, careening through the cabin in a blind panic. His madness escalated as he chased me with a knife, mistaking me for the Grim Reaper come to collect him. The chase was frenetic and terrifying, ending only when his exhaustion overcame him and he collapsed by the door, promising death upon waking. I didn't wait. As he dozed, I armed myself with the old gun and prepared to defend my life or flee into the night. The cabin was silent now, save for the sounds of the wilderness and Pap's labored breathing. I waited, gun poised, ready to sprint into the darkness and reclaim my freedom, away from the tyranny of drunken rants and the looming threat of a life too civilized.
Chapter 7. The Art of Deception and Escaping the Crazed Drunkard.
Get up! What you think you're doing? I opened my eyes, struggling to remember where I was. It was morning, and there stood Pap, looking as sour and sick as a bucket of rotten milk. His breath could have knocked a buzzard off a manure wagon. "What you doing with this gun?" he demanded, eyes wild, the very picture of confusion and hangover. I realized he had no memory of his own rampage, so I said, "Someone tried to get in, so I was laying for him." "Why didn't you wake me?" "Well, I tried, but you were dead to the world." He grumbled. "All right, don't stand there yammering. Go check the lines for breakfast. I'll be along." He unlocked the door, and I bolted up the riverbank. The water was rising, bringing all sorts of debris like it had a mind to clean house. I spotted a beautiful canoe, 13 or 14 feet long, floating like a prize goose. I dove in, clothes and all, and swam to it, half expecting some prankster to jump up and laugh at me. But no, it was real, and I paddled it ashore, figuring Pap would be thrilled. But as luck would have it, he wasn't around. I hid the canoe in a creek overgrown with vines and willows, a perfect little hidey hole. Then I saw Pap, oblivious, aiming at a bird with his gun. Perfect. The man could have missed an elephant in a phone booth. But there he was, playing hunter. When he finally came along, I was pulling up a trot line, soaking wet. He scolded me for being slow, and I told him I fell in the river. He grumbled but didn't ask questions, seeing I was drenched. We caught 5 catfish and headed home. After breakfast, both of us worn out, Pap knocked back a barrel of water and mumbled about shooting prowlers. That gave me the idea I needed. I had to stage my own death to get away for good. Pap raised up a minute to guzzle more water and mumbled, "Next time you rouse me out, man wasn't here for no good. I'd have shot him, you hear?" "Sure, Pap," I said, nodding earnestly. But inside, gears were turning. This was my ticket out. Around noon, we went up the bank. The river was rising fast, bringing more driftwood. A log raft floated by, and we towed it ashore. Pap, eager to sell, locked me in the cabin and took off. I waited until he was a speck on the river, then got to work. I sawed my way out, grabbed a sack of cornmeal, bacon, whiskey, coffee, sugar, ammunition, and all essentials. I cleaned out the cabin. I dragged everything to the hidden canoe, careful not to leave tracks. I even staged a murder scene, killing a wild pig and making it look like I'd been slaughtered. And I dragged a sack of rocks from the pig's fake blood trail to the river, dumped it in, and hoped it would look convincing. I scattered some of my hair and blood on the scene for effect. I was ready to vanish. I floated the canoe downriver, hid under some willows, and planned my escape. Jackson's Island, isolated and forgotten, would be my refuge. I laid back, smoking my pipe, and listened to the distant voices from the ferry landing. They wouldn't follow me there. As I drifted off, I heard a skiff. Peeking out, I saw Pap, sober for once, rowing. He passed close, but I didn't move. As soon as he was out of sight, I paddled downstream, making for Jackson's Island. The moon was bright, the river serene. I floated among the driftwood, listening to the night. I heard conversations from the ferry landing, snippets of their mundane lives. They were gossiping about the latest scandal, the preacher's daughter caught sneaking out, and some fool's plans to build a floating casino. Reaching Jackson's Island, I hid the canoe in a dense willow thicket. I sat on a log, watching the river, the town lights twinkling 3 miles away. A lumber raft drifted by, a man calling commands. I could hear it all, clear as day. With dawn approaching, I retreated into the woods for a nap. Tomorrow would be the start of my new life.
Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk.
When I woke up, the sun was well up, casting long shadows through the trees. I stretched and took stock of my new domain. Jackson's Island was perfect, secluded, forgotten, and crawling with wildlife. I'd live like a king here, far from Pap's reach. I spent the morning setting up camp, making a snug little nest among the trees. I gathered firewood, set traps for game, and explored every nook and cranny of the island. There were hidden clearings, dense thickets, and even a small cave. This place was a fortress. By afternoon, I was hungry. I checked my traps and found a rabbit, which I cooked over a small fire. As I ate, I thought about the widow and Miss Watson. They'd be worried sick, thinking I'd been murdered. But it was better this way. They'd mourn for a while, then move on, and I'd be free. As the sun set, I climbed a tree and watched the river. The town was a distant glow, and the river flowed quietly, carrying away all my troubles. I felt a strange sense of peace. I was alone, but not lonely. I was free. Night fell, and I lay back, looking at the stars through the leaves. The sky seemed impossibly vast, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged to it. No more Pap, no more rules, just me, the river, and the stars. I drifted off to sleep with a smile on my face, ready for whatever adventures tomorrow might bring.
Chapter 8 of Corpses, Cannons, and Curious Companions.
The sun was up so high when I woke that I figured it must be past 8 o'clock. I lay there in the cool grass and shade, feeling downright content and lazy. The sun peeked through the tree canopy in a few spots, casting dappled patches on the ground, which danced about with the breeze. A couple of squirrels sat on a limb, chattering at me like we were old friends. I didn't feel like getting up to cook breakfast. The temptation to doze off again was strong. Just as I was about to drift back into dreamland, a deep boom sounded from upriver. I jolted up, leaning on my elbow to listen. Soon enough, it came again. I sprang to my feet and peered through the leaves. I saw a cloud of smoke hanging over the water, up near the ferry. The ferry boat was full of people, and I knew what was going on. They were firing cannons to make my dead body float to the surface. I was hungry, but starting a fire would give me away. So I watched the cannon smoke and listened to the booms. The river looked beautiful on that summer morning. even as it hid me from folks trying to dredge up my remains. Then I remembered they sometimes put quicksilver in bread loaves and floated them downriver to find drowned bodies. Maybe I could snag one for breakfast. I moved to the Illinois side of the island, and sure enough, a big double loaf came floating by. I almost had it with a long stick, but it slipped away. Eventually, another one drifted near, and this time I caught it. I removed the plug, dumped out the quicksilver, and bit into it. It was real baker's bread, the kind rich folks eat, none of that corn pone nonsense. Settling down in a cozy spot among the leaves, I munched on the bread, feeling rather pleased with myself. The ferry boat floated closer, and I knew I'd get a good look at who was aboard. As it drifted near, I lay down behind a log, peeking through a fork. Everyone was there. Pap, Judge Thatcher, Bessie Thatcher, Joe Harper, Tom Sawyer, Aunt Polly, Sid, Mary, and more. They were all chattering about the murder. The captain called out, "Look sharp! The current sets in close here. Maybe he's tangled in the brush." They crowded the rails, staring right at me, but they didn't see me. "Stand away!" the captain yelled, and the cannon blasted. The noise deafened me, and the smoke blinded me. If they'd loaded bullets, I'd be a goner. The boat drifted on, out of sight, still booming now and then. After about an hour, they gave up and headed back to town. With no more search parties on my tail, I relaxed. I gathered my traps and made a snug camp in the woods. I caught a catfish, cleaned it with my saw, and had a fine supper. As night fell, I sat by my campfire, feeling content. But soon, the loneliness crept in. I wandered to the riverbank, watching the stars and drift logs until sleep took over. For 3 days, it was the same routine. Then, on the 4th day, I explored the island, my domain. I found strawberries, summer grapes, and raspberries, all ripe and ready. I even stumbled upon a snake. But as I chased it, I discovered a campfire's ashes, still smoking. My heart leaped into my throat. I retreated on tiptoes, breath coming hard. Back at my camp, I packed everything into the canoe, put out the fire, scattered the ashes, and climbed a tree. 2 hours later, seeing and hearing nothing, I climbed down and decided to investigate at night. As darkness fell, I paddled across to the Illinois bank. In the woods, I cooked supper, but then I heard horses and voices. I packed up quickly and paddled back to my island, deciding to sleep in the canoe. But sleep was elusive. Every rustle and creak set my nerves on edge. Determined to uncover who was sharing the island with me, I took my paddle and slid along the shadows, heading toward the campfire. I found it at dawn, a man sleeping near the fire. It was Jim, Miss Watson's runaway slave. "Hello, Jim," I said, skipping out. Jim jumped up, terrified. "Don't hurt me, don't. I hain't ever done no harm to a ghost. I always liked dead people and done all I could for 'em. You go and get into river again, why you belongs, and don't do nothing to Ola Jim. Adazala's your friend." I quickly reassured him I wasn't dead. Once he calmed down, he was thrilled to see me. I was no longer alone. "It's good daylight. Let's get breakfast. Make up your campfire," I said. "What's the use of making up the campfire to cook strawberries and sich? But you got a gun, ain't you? Then we can get something better." "Is that what you've been living on?" "I couldn't get nothing else," he said. "How long have you been on the island, Jim?" "Since the night after you was killed." "All that time?" "Yes." "Indeedy." "Nah, ain't you had nothing but that kind of rubbish to eat?" "No, sah, nothing else." "Well, you must be nearly starved." "I reckon I could eat a hoss. How long you been on de Elon?" "Since the night I got killed." "No, wait, what have you lived on?" I showed him my stash of provisions. Jim was impressed, thinking it was all witchcraft. We caught a big catfish, and Jim cleaned it and fried it for breakfast. After breakfast, we lounged on the grass, full and content. Jim finally asked, "But looky here, Huck, who was it dat is killed in dat shanty if it warn't you?" Nah. I told him the whole story, and he praised my cleverness, saying even Tom Sawyer couldn't have done better. "How do you come to be here, Jim?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Maybe I better not tell." "Why, Jim?" "Well, day's reasons. But you wouldn't tell on me if I told you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck. I underscore runoff underscore." "Jim, but mind, you said you wouldn't tell." "I won't. Honest underscore engine underscore. Now, let's hear it." Well, it was this way. Miss Watson said she wouldn't sell me down to Orleans, but I heard her say she could get $800 for me, and it is too much to raise us. So I lit out, and been hiding ever since. We settled into a routine, hiding by day and moving by night. Jim had all sorts of superstitions and signs about the future. He believed he'd be rich one day because he had hairy arms and chest, which he said was a sure sign. He told me tales of his previous attempts to get rich, each ending in disaster, like the time he invested in livestock and the cow died, or the bank run by a one-legged man that went bust. Despite everything, Jim was optimistic. I owns myself, and I's with $800. I wished I had the money. I wouldn't want no mo. And so we lived on the island, hidden from the world, two runaways making the best of our freedom.
Chapter 9. Huck, Jim, and the Art of Subterranean Living.
I wanted to check out a spot smack dab in the middle of the island, a little gem I stumbled upon during one of my bouts of aimless wandering. So we set off, and it wasn't long before we reached it, seeing as the island was a measly 3 miles long and about as narrow as a dieting snake. The spot in question was a hill, or a ridge if you're feeling fancy, about 40 feet high, as steep as a bank's interest rate and thick with bushes like a conspiracy theorist's plot. We scrambled and clawed our way to the top, which proved to be a decent workout, and discovered a cavern almost hidden in the rock face. This cavern was a spacious affair, big enough to house a small circus, and Jim could stand up without giving himself a concussion, which was a nice bonus. Inside, it was as cool as an executive's handshake. Jim, ever the practical one, suggested we move our gear into this natural fortress straight away. I, on the other hand, argued that unless we planned on growing wings, schlepping up and down that hill would get old fast. Jim countered with the tactical advantage. With the canoe stashed away neatly and all our worldly possessions secreted in the cave, we could vanish at a moment's notice should any overly curious souls come poking around. Plus, he added, the birds chirped something about rain coming, and did I really want our stuff to get soaked? Convinced by his foresight, or maybe just tired of arguing, we paddled back, fetched our gear, and set up shop in the cave. Nearby, we found the perfect thicket to hide the canoe, then took a moment to check our fishing lines. With dinner prospects looking good, we turned our attention to setting up camp. The cave's entrance was grand enough to roll a hogshead through, and just beside it was a flat spot ideal for a campfire. So there we built our fire and cooked up a feast. We spread blankets inside, making the cave feel less like a hole in the ground and more like a home, and enjoyed our meal shielded from the elements. As we dined, the weather turned just as the local avian meteorologists had predicted. Thunder rolled like a bowling ball in an alley, lightning flashed like paparazzi at a celebrity scandal, and the rain came down in sheets thick enough to lose a dog in. The wind howled, bending trees to its will, and in the flashes of light, the treetops danced a frantic jig, far off and ghostly. Then darkness swallowed everything again, and the thunder grumbled like a hungry stomach down the vast sky. Jim, this is nice, I said, savoring the wild concert outside. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else but here. Pass me another piece of that fish, and some more of that hot cornbread. Well, you wouldn't have been here if it hadn't been for Jim. You'd have been down there in the woods without any dinner getting yourself drowned, Jim reminded me with a grin. Chickens know when it's going to rain, and so do the birds, child. As the days passed, the river rose ominously, swallowing the island's lower reaches and turning the Illinois side into a vast inland sea. Our side, hemmed in by imposing bluffs, stayed mostly dry, but watching the river rise was like watching the world's slowest suspense film. Daytime was for canoe adventures. The island's interior was an oasis of cool shadows, a stark contrast to the sun-scorched riverbanks. We wove through the trees, sometimes rerouting around impassable thickets of vines. Wildlife was abundant. Rabbits, snakes, and other critters became oddly tame, driven desperate by the flood. We could have started a zoo with the number of animals that seemed ready to follow us home. One particularly adventurous night, we snagged a section of a lumber raft, just some nice pine planks that had come loose. It was a solid platform, about 15 feet long and wide enough to stage a small play on. We didn't bother with the saw logs that floated by during the day. Daylight was no friend to two fugitives like us. Another night, right before dawn, we stumbled upon a real prize, a floating house, ambling down the river like it had all the time in the world. It was tilted like it had one too many, a 2-story drifting disaster. We boarded via an upstairs window and waited for daylight to explore our find. As the first light filtered in, we took stock of our surroundings. The place was a mess. clothes, old cards, and empty whiskey bottles everywhere. A dead man lay in the corner, a grim reminder of the house's last moments. Jim, ever the brave soul, confirmed the man's status. He's dead, all right. Been dead for days. Don't look at his face, Huck. It's a sight too ghastly. We plundered what we could use, clothes, a butcher knife, even a raggedy old bedquilt. As we left, I snagged an old straw hat, and Jim, ever the collector, picked up a wooden leg, though neither of us could use it. Loaded with our loot, we paddled away, making sure Jim was well hidden under the quilt. The river carried us silently past the Illinois shore, and we slipped back home, unseen and richer for our troubles.
Chapter 10. Dead Men, Disguises, and Dumb Luck.
After breakfast, I was itching to talk about the dead man we found, but Jim wasn't having any of it. He said it would bring bad luck and maybe even a haunting. According to Jim, a man who wasn't properly buried was more likely to come back and haunt folks. It sounded pretty sensible, so I dropped it, though I couldn't stop wondering who killed him and why. We rummaged through the clothes we found and discovered $8 sewn into the lining of an old blanket overcoat. Jim figured the people in that house must have stolen the coat, because if they knew about the money, they wouldn't have left it. I suggested they might have killed the guy too, but Jim clammed up. "Now you think it's bad luck," I said. "But what did you say when I brought in that snakeskin I found the other day? You said it was the worst luck in the world to touch a snakeskin. Well, here's your bad luck. We've got all this stuff and $8 besides. I wish we had this kind of bad luck every day, Jim." "Never you mind, honey. Never you mind. Don't you get too pert. It's a comin'. Mind I tell you, it's a comin'." And sure enough, it did. On Tuesday, we had our little chat about bad luck. By Friday after dinner, we were lying around in the grass, out of tobacco. I went to the cavern to get some, and there was a rattlesnake in there. I killed it, and thinking I'd have some fun, curled it up on Jim's blanket to give him a scare. By nightfall, I forgot all about it. When Jim lay down, its mate was there and bit him right on the heel. Jim jumped up, yelling, and the snake was ready to strike again. I whacked it with a stick, and Jim grabbed Pap's whiskey jug and started pouring it down. He was barefooted, and the snake bite was on his heel. Jim told me to chop off the snake's head, skin it, and roast a piece of it. He ate the roasted snake, saying it would help cure him. He also made me tie the rattles around his wrist, for extra measure. Then I quietly tossed the snake's remains into the bushes, hoping Jim wouldn't realize it was all my fault. Jim sucked at that whiskey jug like it was ambrosia, occasionally going out of his head, ranting and raving. His foot and legs swelled up like balloons, but soon enough the alcohol knocked him out and I figured he was all right. Still, I'd rather take a snake bite than Pap's whiskey. Jim was laid up for 4 days and nights. When the swelling finally went down, he was up and about again. I swore off snakeskins forever. Jim said I'd believe him next time. He reckoned we hadn't seen the end of that bad luck yet. I was starting to think he might be right. Old Hank Bunker once looked at the new moon over his left shoulder and bragged about it. Less than 2 years later, he got drunk, fell off a shot tower, and spread himself out so flat they had to slide him between 2 barn doors for a coffin. Pap told me about it. Hank's fate convinced me looking at the new moon over your left shoulder was the dumbest thing you could do. The river settled back into its banks, and we baited a big hook with a skinned rabbit. We caught a catfish as big as a man, 6 feet 2 inches and over 200 pounds. We couldn't handle it and just watched as it thrashed around until it drowned. Inside its stomach, we found a brass button, a round ball, and lots of other junk. We split the ball open with a hatchet and found a spool inside. Jim reckoned the fish had been carrying it around for ages. The next morning, I was bored and wanted some excitement. I suggested slipping over to town to see what was going on. Jim liked the idea, but said I should go at night and in disguise. So we shortened one of the calico gowns, and I turned up my trouser legs to my knees and got into it. Jim hooked it behind, and I tied a sunbonnet under my chin. Jim said nobody would recognize me even in daylight. I practiced all day, getting used to the outfit. Jim said I had to stop pulling up my gown to get at my breeches pocket. By the end of the day, I was pretty good at it. I started across the river after dark. I landed a little below the ferry landing and tied up. There was a light in a shanty that hadn't been lived in for ages. Curious, I peeped in and saw a woman about 40, knitting by a candle. I didn't recognize her, so I knocked on the door, determined to play the part of a girl. She opened the door and squinted at me. "Who's there?" "Just a poor girl, ma'am, looking for some help." "Well, come in then. Don't stand out there all night," she said, eyeing me suspiciously. I stepped in, trying to remember I was a girl. "Thank you, ma'am. I've been traveling and lost my way." Sit down. You must be tired. What's your name? Sarah Williams, I blurted out, remembering the name Jim and I had come up with. Sarah, huh? Where are you from? Hookerville, ma'am. I was heading to my uncle's, but got turned around in the dark. She kept knitting, looking at me now and then. Well, Sarah, you picked a fine time to travel. There's talk of murder in these parts. Murder? I feigned shock. Yep, they say a boy named Huck Finn was killed. Some folks think it was his drunkard of a pap. Others say it was a runaway slave. They've been searching the river for his body. I tried to look scared and innocent. That's terrible, ma'am. Do they know who did it? Not yet, but they're close. Why, just the other day, a group of men nearly caught that runaway slave. They say he's hiding on an island nearby. You be careful, Sarah. The world's full of dangerous folks. Yes, ma'am, I will.
We talked a bit more, and I got all the information I needed. As I left, I felt a thrill of excitement and fear. I paddled back to the island, feeling like I was part of a grand adventure. Jim and I had to stay on our toes. The hunt was on, and we were right in the middle of it.
Chapter 11. Huck, the Woman, and the Art of Prevarication.
Come in, the woman said, and I stepped inside, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. Her eyes glinted like marbles as she looked me over from head to toe. Take a seat, she said. I complied, trying to appear as nonchalant as a runaway kid pretending to be a girl can be. She didn't waste time getting to the point. What's your name? Sarah Williams, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. And where are you from? Around here? No, ma'am. I'm from Hookerville, 7 miles downriver. Walked the whole way, and I'm plumb tired out. You must be hungry then. I'll fetch you something to eat. No, ma'am, I'm not hungry. Stopped a couple of miles back at a farm. Ate so much I can't hardly move. My mother's sick and out of money. I came to find my uncle, Abner Moore. He lives at the upper end of town. I don't know him, she said, shaking her head. I haven't been here long. Only about 2 weeks. Upper end of town is quite a hike. Why don't you stay here for the night? Take off your bonnet and rest. No, thank you, I said quickly. I'll rest a bit and then go on. I'm not afraid of the dark. She insisted that her husband could escort me when he got back, and then launched into a long-winded monologue about her life, her relatives up and down the river, and their poor decision to move here. I was beginning to regret coming to her for information when she finally veered onto a topic of interest, my supposed murder. She recounted the town gossip about the $6,000 Tom and I found, erroneously inflated to $10,000 in her version. She painted my pap as a villain and me as a hard-luck case, before getting to the crux of the matter. Who done it? I asked, feigning curiosity. We've heard rumors down in Hookerville, but no one knows who killed Huck Finn.
She nodded sagely. Well, folks here think old Finn might have done it himself. Really? I said, doing my best to sound shocked. Sure did. Nearly got lynched before they decided it was likely a runaway slave named Jim.
My heart skipped a beat. I had to be careful. Why him? I asked, trying to sound casual. No. Well, the black dude ran off the very night Huck Finn was killed. They figured he did it and fled. There's a reward out for him, $300, and $200 for old Finn, too. They thought he did it, but then they found out about Jim and put the blame on him.
I tried to hide my growing unease, fiddling with a needle I picked up from the table. Are they still after him?
Of course they are. $300 doesn't come around every day. Some folks think he's hiding out on Jackson's Island. My husband's going over there tonight to check. My stomach lurched. I needed to warn Jim. $300 is a lot of money, I said. Is your husband going tonight? Yes. He went to town to get a boat and another gun. They're going after midnight. Wouldn't it be easier in the daytime? She laughed. Sure, but easier for him to see them, too. In the dark, they can sneak up on him better. I nodded, trying to seem interested, but I was on edge. She noticed my fidgeting and asked, What did you say your name was, honey? I panicked. Mary Williams, I blurted, realizing too late I'd said Sarah earlier. Honey, I thought you said it was Sarah. Oh, yes, I did. Sarah Mary Williams. Some call me Sarah, some call me Mary. She eyed me suspiciously, but let it slide. She talked about hard times, rats, and life in general, all while I itched to leave. Finally, she handed me a bar of lead and asked me to throw it at a rat. I missed on purpose, just like a girl would, but it wasn't enough to fool her. What's your real name? She asked suddenly, looking me straight in the eye. What, ma'am? Your real name, is it Bill, Tom, or Bob? I stammered. Please don't poke fun at a poor girl like me, ma'am. If I'm in the way? No, sit down. I'm not going to hurt you or tell on you. Just tell me your secret, and I'll help you. So I spilled a half-truth about being an orphaned runaway apprentice mistreated by a cruel farmer. I was making my way to my fictional uncle, Abner Moore, in the mythical town of Goshen. Goshen? This isn't Goshen. This is St. Petersburg. Goshen is 10 miles upriver. I feigned shock. A man told me this was Goshen. He was drunk, I reckon. Stay here. I'll pack you a snack. She put together a small bundle of food and asked me a series of country living questions, testing my knowledge. I answered correctly, convincing her I was genuine. She gave me final advice on how to better play a girl and sent me on my way. I retraced my steps back to the canoe, paddling furiously back to Jim. Bursting into the cave, I shook him awake. Get up, Jim. They're after us. Jim didn't need to be told twice. In a whirlwind of activity, we packed everything onto our raft and slipped away under the cover of night, silent and determined, blending into the shadows as we floated downriver to freedom.
This is the end of part 1 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, reimagined in the style of best-selling author Kurt Vonnegut. If you are enjoying this classic book reimagined, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Classic Books Reimagined channel. The remaining episodes of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn can be found in the playlist. Thank you for listening. We will see you in the next episode.